He died on a cross. That much is clear. Eyewitnesses watched it happen. Even the most skeptical historians agree. It was real. But then something broke the script, because the tomb they laid him in was empty, because the women who came on the third day ran away in fear, because dozens claimed, "We saw him alive." The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is, why did millions believe it? And why do they still? I'm Moon Whispers. And this time, we're confronting the most delicate claim in Christian history. Was the stone really rolled away? Or was it the most brilliant illusion ever crafted? Buckle up. We're entering the realm where faith defies death itself. Subscribe to our channel if you love deep, slow-burning historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? We love seeing our global community grow. He died. That's the central claim of Christianity. Without it, there is no resurrection, no salvation, no faith. But what do we really know about the death of Jesus? Let's rewind to the 1st century, a hot Judean spring. Sabbath approaching, 3 crosses stand on a hill. On one of them hangs a man some called the King of the Jews. It seems straightforward, but only at first glance. Because here's the first red flag. There are no non-Christian records describing Jesus' execution. No Roman documents. No Jewish chronicles from that time. All we have are texts written decades later by his followers. Crucifixion was one of the most brutal forms of execution ever devised. It wasn't just about killing. It was about spectacle. Romans reserved it for slaves, rebels, and the worst criminals. It was a public, slow, humiliating process designed to break bodies and send a message. Victims could hang for hours, even days. Death came from suffocation, heart failure, blood loss, often all at once. Soldiers broke bones, pierced organs, and left corpses to rot in the sun as food for vultures and dogs. But in Jesus' case, something's off. He died too fast. The Gospels say he died within hours. Pilate was surprised. He's already dead? One theory says he was physically broken, beaten, interrogated, sleep-deprived. Another theory suggests his death was hastened, deliberately. John's Gospel says soldiers broke the legs of the others, but not Jesus. He was already dead. Still, just to be sure, they pierced his side with a spear. But did anyone check if he was really dead? History records a rare case. The historian Josephus writes of a man crucified, then removed alive, and saved with medical care. That doesn't prove Jesus survived, but it proves that crucifixion didn't always equal death. And if he died quickly, without autopsy, without confirmation, then a question lingers. Was it irreversible? Another oddity, his burial. Normally, crucified bodies weren't buried. They were left on the cross to rot as a warning. But Jesus, we're told, was buried in a private tomb, given by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Who was he? Why would Pilate release the body to a non-relative? Why such a privilege? If his followers retrieved the body, what happened next? How long was it there? Who saw it? And why is it that Paul, the earliest Christian writer, says almost nothing about the event itself? No Golgotha, no tomb, no Pilate, no women at the cross, just a simple creed. Christ died for our sins. This silence leads some scholars to wonder, was the crucifixion story as we know it shaped later to serve a purpose? In mythology, every hero must die. In religion, death often isn't defeat, it's transformation. The sacrifice validates the message. Jesus' death may have been that kind of death, one not remembered in detail, but in meaning. And so the question isn't just, did he die? It's, are we sure? And if we're not, how can we talk about resurrection? Coming up, the tomb. Was it really empty? And if it was, why do the sources disagree on what happened next? The tomb was empty. That's the traditional claim. It stands as Christianity's physical proof of resurrection. The logic goes, no body means the body must have risen. But let's look closer. Sometimes silence speaks louder than Scripture. When we turn to the earliest Christian sources, particularly the letters of Paul, written just 20, 30 years after Jesus' death, there's something striking. No mention of a tomb at all. Zero. Paul simply says, Christ died and was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. No geography, no stone, no guards, no women. What does that tell us? The four Gospels offer four versions of the resurrection, and when it comes to the tomb, they agree on almost nothing. Who went there? Mark says 3 women, Matthew says 2, John says 1. Who did they see? 1 angel? 2? A young man in white? When did they arrive? Before sunrise or after? What happened next? This isn't eyewitness reporting, it's literary storytelling. And when a historian sees such contradictions, they ask, are we dealing with fact or the evolution of legend? If the tomb was real, why doesn't Paul mention it? Why isn't it a place of pilgrimage in the early church? Even Christian leaders in 2nd century Jerusalem didn't know where it was. It would only be discovered in the 4th century, under orders from Emperor Constantine. This leads many to believe the tomb wasn't a place, it was a symbol, a dramatic stage, frightened women, empty silence, blinding light, not history, psychology. And who verifies the empty tomb? No Roman official, no Pharisee. All witnesses are insiders, women, followers, believers. And the only proof? Absence. But absence isn't evidence of resurrection. It can mean theft, mistake, legend, or even deliberate design. And history is full of empty spaces that later became sacred. In other mythologies, gods die and return. Osiris, torn apart and revived by Isis and Horus. Mithras, linked to rebirth and spring. Tammuz, Adonis, Dionysus, all have rituals of death and return. The tomb is part of a universal pattern. Death, stillness, return, light. It's not a place, it's a metaphor. And here lies the paradox. The tomb is said to be the most important place in Christianity, but it's never described clearly, never visited in early texts, never mapped. It disappears. And when proof disappears, all that's left is belief. Maybe that was the point all along. Coming next, why were women the first to witness the resurrection? And why were their voices so quickly silenced? Imagine the pre-dawn light softening the sky, a hush falling over Jerusalem. Women approached the tomb not as prosecutors, philosophers, or apostles, but with spices, grief, and devotion. They are the first to speak the words that will define an empire. He is not here. These are women, unexpected, marginalized voices, who became the first heralds of resurrection. In 1st century Judea, women's testimonies held almost no legal credibility, especially in court. Yet all 4 canonical Gospels highlight women. Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Joanna, Salome, as first witnesses to resurrection. If this narrative were fabricated, who in their right mind would choose unreliable characters as primary eyewitnesses? That alone gives it a ring of authenticity. Let's meet them. Mary Magdalene, healed, devoted, persistent. Mary, mother of James, and Mary of Clopas, names shifting across accounts but ever present. Joanna, wife of Chusa, steward to Herod Antipas, a woman of means and courtly connection. Salome, mother to James and John. Joanna's inclusion is striking. Some scholars argue she appears centrally in Luke's literary structure, hinting at greater significance, possibly even identifying her with Junia, the notable among the apostles. That pushes beyond symbol toward historical presence. The Gospels diverge. Mark lists 3 women, Matthew 2. Luke includes specific names. John singles out Mary Magdalene. These discrepancies aren't mistakes. They are echoes of tradition, layered narratives showing how the story evolved, reshaped by memory and meaning. Choosing women whose words were not trusted was a bold move. It smacked of risk, not invention. Their narrative became a weapon against institutional decline. It said, salvation starts with those society overlooks. Archetypically, there is power here. The image of women discovering emptiness, then becoming the first to proclaim life, it mirrors myths worldwide. In Egypt, Isis finds Osiris's body. In Greece and Mesopotamia, women embody death and renewal. This is ancient ground, not just history, but something primal. These women, some healed, others followers, some wealthy patrons, weren't idle figures. They fueled the movement when apostles fled. An early scholar noted that women sustained the ministry when leaders vanished. Yet the institutional church soon sidelined them. Mary Magdalene became miscast as a penitent prostitute by influential writers. Joanna disappeared into anonymity. Their voices were narrowed, their legacies muted. But the shift didn't erase their impact. It only highlighted the threat independent witnesses posed to emerging structures. Today's historians see in these women both faith and strategy. They undermined the gilded exclusivity of male discipleship and stepped into the void of public truth. The early church itself tried to sideline them, but the stories endured, survived, because they spoke authenticity. In whisper, moment, these women stood at society's edges and became the axis of faith telling the world. Resurrection wasn't for the powerful. It was for those brave enough to follow sorrow into dawn. Imagine holding a weathered parchment, the first letter to the Corinthians, written not by a distant theologian, but by Paul, a man who believed he met the risen Christ face to face. No tombs, no angels, no dramatic garden scenes, just a sentence. Christ died for our sins, was buried, was raised on the 3rd day. Stark, simple, explosive. This letter is the oldest surviving Christian text. Written within 2 decades of the crucifixion, it predates the Gospels. This isn't myth looking back. This is memory trying to hold. Paul doesn't tell a story. He declares a mystery. In 1 Corinthians 15, he lists the appearances to Peter, to the 12, to over 500 people, to James, and finally, to himself. No mention of women, no details about grave clothes or stone-rolling angels. What matters is not the how, but the that. It happened. It transformed. Paul is laser-focused. Resurrection isn't a ghost tale. It's the core of the faith. If Christ has not been raised, Our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. But what kind of resurrection? What does Paul mean by raised? Natural bodies, spiritual bodies, transformed realities. He writes, "The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body." The Greek here matters. Soma psychikon becomes soma pneumatikon. Psychical body versus spiritual body. It's not body versus spirit, it's body transformed, not less real, perhaps more real. Paul doesn't say Jesus shed his physical body like a snake's skin. He implies a metamorphosis into something imperishable. To modern ears, it sounds like sci-fi theology. But to Paul, this was as urgent as breath. The resurrection wasn't symbolic. It was a new kind of existence breaking into the world. Scholars divide here. Some argue Paul envisioned a purely spiritual phenomenon, non-physical, experiential. Others say his language implies a glorified yet tangible body. The tension remains. Was the resurrection an inner awakening or a cosmic collision? Hallucination theory, mass delusion, or private vision? Modern psychology offers alternatives, that the appearances of Jesus were grief-induced hallucinations. Paul, after all, never met the living Jesus. What he saw was a vision, perhaps akin to trauma-induced phenomena we now understand better. But why would he align his experience with hundreds of others? Why frame it as shared truth, not personal spirituality? And why, if it were just inner healing, did it threaten empires? Some argue early Christians wanted to believe and in wanting saw. But that explanation simplifies the social cost. Resurrection wasn't a private comfort. It was a public revolution. You didn't die for hallucinations. You died for conviction. Alternative texts. The silent chorus outside Paul. Other voices whisper. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't emphasize resurrection at all. The Gospel of Peter offers a surreal vision, a talking cross, a colossal Jesus. Gnostic texts speak of light, not limbs. These writings come later, reflecting communities grappling with what resurrection meant in a world of persecution and doubt. Some saw the body as a prison. Resurrection then was escape, not return. But Paul is earlier, simpler, and more radical. Paul didn't just invent hope, he engineered it. He gave resurrection logic, rhythm, architecture. Not just, he rose, but you will rise. For Paul, Jesus is the first fruits, the preview of humanity's transformation. The resurrection wasn't a single miracle. It was a new blueprint for reality. He doesn't try to prove it, he embodies it, and in doing so, he leaves us with the question, what kind of world begins not with life, but with life reborn? If the body was not revived muscle and blood, but a new kind of being, then perhaps resurrection is less about proving history and more about imagining what comes after the end. Let's dim the lights and sharpen the questions. Jesus was crucified, buried. 3 days passed, then sightings, appearances. First one person, then two, then hundreds. But what were they seeing? A body, a spirit, or something else entirely? Was the resurrection a literal return or a phenomenon of the mind? The theory of visions, from Strauss to psychology. In the 19th century, David Strauss offered a radical idea. Jesus didn't rise. People believed he had. Their grief, longing, and expectations conjured up inner visions. No tomb was opened, no body was touched, just overwhelming faith trying to rewrite unbearable loss. Strauss's theory inspired others, Renan, Reveal, and later filtered into modern critical scholarship. Scholars like Gerd Ludemann and Geza Vermes suggested what happened wasn't physical resurrection, but psychic transformation, an internal experience shared and retold, hallucination or vision. A razor-thin line. Christian apologists argue hallucinations don't build movements. They don't turn cowards into martyrs. N.T. Wright insists, if people had visions of a dead Jesus, the message wouldn't have been, "He is risen," but "We saw his ghost." To claim resurrection was a hallucination, one must ask. Why did so many people experience the same thing in different places at different times? Group hallucinations, medical rarity or social mystery? Psychologists say mass hallucinations are exceedingly rare. Yet Gerd Ludemann proposed a contagious vision. Peter's emotional breakdown sparked a chain reaction. Others followed, swept up in the shared momentum of belief. But is that how minds work? Can shared grief birth shared illusion? Guilt as a trigger. The lure of emotional shock, Ludemann added another twist. Peter's guilt over denying Jesus was so intense, it created a psychological break, a vision of Jesus alive, not a lie, not madness, a crisis-induced moment of clarity. And that single event seeded the others. From trauma came transcendence, cognitive dissonance, when reality doesn't fit the faith. Another theory, cognitive dissonance. The disciples expected a Messiah who would win. Instead, he was executed. The mind couldn't process the contradiction, so it reshaped the story. Dreams became messages. Longing became sightings. This wasn't deception. It was survival of hope. But what about the 500 witnesses? Paul writes of Jesus appearing to over 500 people at once. Critics say, impossible. Even hallucinations don't scale like that. But apologists respond, Paul dared his readers to ask them. He wasn't hiding a myth. He was pointing to memory, mass delusion or mass testimony. Medical models. But do they explain enough? Some suggest psychiatric diagnoses, conversion disorder, grief hallucinations, or mass suggestion. But even in clinical settings, such clarity of vision and its explosive social consequences remain rare, if not unmatched. And would people die for a momentary vision? If the resurrection was a hallucination, it was the most consequential one in history. But maybe that misses the point. Maybe faith isn't about what the eyes saw, but what the soul needed to see. And the real question is, what's more powerful? A proven fact or a transformed life? Step quietly now. We're entering the realm of forbidden pages. These are the texts that didn't make the cut, the Gospels that whispered a little too boldly, Apocrypha, Gnostics, stories where the resurrection isn't flesh, it's fire. And to understand them, we have to listen where the silence gets loud. Not just extra Gospels, but alternate realities. The apocryphal Gospels aren't fan fiction, they're entire spiritual worlds. From the mysterious Gospel of James to the dreamlike visions of Peter, these texts didn't just color outside the lines, they redrew the map. They emerged from communities that didn't see Jesus the same way. They needed a different kind of Messiah, one who taught in riddles, who didn't bleed, who rose not in body, but in spirit. The Gospel of Peter, resurrection goes full mythic. Discovered in Egypt, the Gospel of Peter doesn't tiptoe. Jesus dies, but he doesn't suffer. His final words, my power, my power. And then a cross that walks and talks. Angels, a cosmic light show. This isn't history. It's sacred cinema. But behind the spectacle lies a message. Resurrection wasn't just return, it was conquest, a divine jailbreak, a God who refused to play by Roman rules. Other gospels, other rules. Take the Gospel of Thomas, no crucifixion, no tomb, no comeback, just sayings, dozens of them. Jesus as a cryptic sage, not a sacrifice. Salvation not through death, but through knowing. Or the Apocryphon of John, where Jesus returns post-resurrection to reveal secret knowledge, a blueprint of the universe. The body? Irrelevant. Resurrection? A shift in perception. The Gnostic turn, spirit over flesh. In the Gnostic apocalypse of Peter, Jesus explains what died wasn't truly him. The real Christ was untouched, observing the crucifixion from above. Matter was a mistake. Spirit, the truth. Death, just a costume change. It's not resurrection, it's revelation, not a return, but a release. The letter to Reginos, Resurrection as Realization 1, apocryphal gem, is the treatise on the resurrection, framed as a letter. Its claim? Believers are already risen, not because of a corpse leaving a tomb, but because they've awakened to something higher. Jesus had flesh, yes, but resurrection wasn't about reanimation. It was about transcendence. Why this matters. These texts weren't minor footnotes. They were rival gospels, competing blueprints for belief. And they show us resurrection wasn't always one idea. It was many. The canon was not inevitable. It was chosen, and every choice leaves other paths behind. Moon whisper, reflection, the Apocrypha. Don't close the book. They open side doors. If resurrection is more than a fact, if it's a transformation, a symbol, a shift, then maybe the real miracle isn't the body that stood up. Maybe it's the souls that never sat back down. What remains when the facts dissolve into dust? When the tomb is empty, the echoes fade, and history folds into silence. Sometimes it's not the evidence that keeps a story alive. It's the absence of it. The Shroud of Turin, an image scorched into cloth, debated for centuries. Carbon dating says it's medieval. Others claim older origins. DNA, pollen, blood types, all examined. But none of it screams resurrection. It whispers ambiguity. A trace, not a testimony. Other relics exist too. Fragments of the cross, drops of sacred blood, thorns from a crown. They are venerated, displayed, kissed, but none of them tell the story. They only reflect the longing. Like footprints in fog, they show direction, not destination. Even believers approach these relics with reverence and reservation. The irony? The faith they represent grew stronger than the artifacts themselves. The resurrection didn't survive because of relics. It outlived them. But why do we need resurrection? Because death terrifies. Because silence hurts. Because the idea of a life that ends in finality is a truth too heavy to carry. Resurrection is the rebellion of hope against entropy. Faith doesn't wait for confirmation. It leaps over the void, and in that leap, it changes the world. Not through arguments or proofs, but through transformation. Through the soft revolution of hearts convinced that love can outlast decay. That is why a story without a visible hero changed billions. There is no body to show, no grave to honor, and yet the idea lives on, louder than statues, older than churches, deeper than dogmas. There's a cruel beauty in this. A narrative born of disappearance became the most enduring presence. The stone rolled away not to reveal a body, but to uncover a question. And perhaps that's all we need. A question that rings, that refuses to close, that breathes in silence. Because sometimes a whisper is louder than a shout, and an empty tomb says more than 1,000 sermons.